Okay, welcome back to the Hogtown Podcast, episode 61, with a return guest, Sam Hammond, who I think your title is AI Policy Lead, right, for the Foundation of
Yep,
American
director.
Innovation? Director, okay, and you're in Washington D.C., but you're a Canadian, now kind of like informing and thinking about AI policy in the U.S.
That's right. Yeah, I've been here for about 12 years.
Yeah, so we had this good chat. I don't even remember how long ago it was, but we had this podcast, as I think I told you then, is mostly about Toronto housing policy. It's really about like the thesis is about like how could Toronto be a better city, at the limit of global city. But we kind of bleed into provincial policy, we bleed into federal policy, and I think there's a lot that we could talk about on the AI policy side, mostly federal. And just to set this up, we were DMing, and you sent me this kind of like interesting set of messages. And I'll start by reading these, and maybe this will kind of like inform where I think we should take this conversation. It's very interesting, so I'd love to hear you elaborate. So very briefly, you told me, my too long didn't read is that Canada is basically screwed. We realistically have 6 months to acquire 5+ gigawatts of compute, reform copyright laws, and unlock the requisite energy and grid needs. Most likely futures involve dissolution of the 20th century nation state, bipolar world order centered on the US and China, perhaps not in their current institutional form, but rather runaway AI-driven economies with novel institutional forms centered around a handful of city-states with compute infrastructure. Canada has a choice to ally with US or China. Economy, geography suggests the US, but there's some probability that the US invents ASI, artificial superintelligence, but China is first to diffuse it into fully automated luxury communism. Barring World War III or an offset from space dominance, the US disintegrates Soviet style and China emerges as a global hegemon before we transition into a post-human regime where if we're not all dead, we are subordinated to swarm superintelligence that's replicating itself across the Milky Way.
Sounds about right. Where do you want to start?
Okay, so I think we started at the top and we work our way down. So the first thing that struck me as like very specific and interesting was this 6-month timeline. So maybe tell us about like why you think these next 6 months are so critical and so critical to a point that maybe beyond which AI has superseded our ability to have policy catch up in any meaningful way.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it comes down to three simple words, which is recursive self-improvement. Recursive self-improvement refers to the moment in time when AIs do a better job of AI R&D than the leading AI researchers at the companies. And this is a threshold where it's sort of a spectrum, right? So the AIs are already much better than humans at coding. At companies like Anthropic, they produce 99% of code output. They're also training themselves now. They're being trained to do the pre and post training, to do all the data filtering, to do all the systems engineering. The company is very, very close to being basically fully autonomous as it is. But that's leading up to true RSI, and we're seeing an acceleration from that uplift. I have friends at Anthropic who burn multiple base salaries of tokens. I think the leader at OpenAI burns 1 billion tokens a month. So the futures here is very evenly distributed, right? But once we cross that threshold into fully automate AI R&D, no one really quite knows what happens next. But rough approximation is that we essentially speed run deep learning and AI. That any algorithm, any new architecture gets discovered really rapidly. If you actually just do a linear regression on the release of new models over time, that predicts that by January of 2027, we should be having like a new frontier capability jump every day. Now, I don't think that will actually be happening. I think instead it will be like internal to the companies as they are going through this takeoff period.
You mentioned that you elaborated in a post that like you imagine a 5.2 to 5.6 type leap, and your regression suggests that by like January 6, 2027 or something like that, if we follow the current acceleration and model release timelines, if they were to release them, it would be like every 24 hours, like that level of capability.
Yeah, or faster, right? It's because it continues to feed back on itself like a chain reaction. This is what sometimes called the intelligence explosion, right? With like analogy to like a nuclear chain reaction. As I said, we don't totally know what that leads to, but I think we can be fairly confident it leads to much faster AI progress. May lead to uncontrollable forms of superintelligence. It may end up plateauing, and we have some kind of quasi automated AI R&D that is still missing pieces that take a year or two to then break through. But the writing will be on the wall at that point. And this is why I give that 6-month timeline, even if it takes 12 months. There's a lot of lead time that any country has that needs to build the kind of infrastructure that will be required to be in the the upside of this transformation. These data centers take time to build, the grid and energy infrastructure that's needed to supply them. And then I mentioned copyright law because it's a big inhibitor in Canada and Australia and much of Europe.
Would that be for training data? Like what it's being trained on might be constrained by copyright law?
Yeah, the U.S. has a very permissive fair use doctrine with copyright that treats data used for training as fair use, quote unquote, meaning it's transformative. It doesn't violate anyone's copyright.
Sorry, just on that point, because in this, like, ultimately I want to work our way towards like policy proposals or prescriptions for Canada, but like, am I right to, so like, I don't see a scenario, especially not with your timeline, even if you double or triple it, where Canada is training frontier models. So if we're just kind of like building out inference capacity to run American frontier models or open source Chinese frontier models, do our copyright laws really constrain anything?
Maybe not. I give it as sort of like probably the policy blocker. It may become irrelevant. I still think it matters to have your own inference capacity, but also once we tip over into fully automated AI R&D, why can't we train our own models? So if we have access to those American models, we have access to the top of the world's top AI researcher.
Yeah, because I guess like one way that we talk a lot about sovereign AI and so on, certainly in policy in Canada, and what, like, there's this one take that like really you have to like maximize your access to American or Chinese models because those will American will continue to be frontier, Chinese will continue to be, call it, 6 and 9 months behind the frontier, but as capabilities improve, presumably a larger share of tasks you might want to automate can be done by non-frontier models. So it might still make sense to have like domestic, whatever, sovereign models that could do like 90% of stuff that don't require the frontier. Like, there's still this important question around the frontier, but is that a scenario where we should not just give up on I guess, training models altogether?
Yeah, I think training as a share of total compute is going to continue declining, just because there's going to be such massive buildups of inference. But there's that trickle down, and then sovereign AI is a bit of a marketing term, but I do think there's if this technology will automate significant parts of the economy, you don't want your economy running in a data center in someone else's jurisdiction.
That's right. Yeah, I've thought of like inference data centers as the future labor workforce, and you want like domestic workers, presumably, especially if you have kind of like an often contentious bilateral relationship as Canada does.
And it's not just bilateral. Like the U.S. is export controlled Fable, right. Anthropic's Mythos capable model, and have started to basically pick and choose who gets access to these capabilities, not just Canada, but our allies and partners internationally. So you can't put your full trust in that.
Yeah, your regression, you called it on Twitter like a naive regression. So it's just kind of like estimating that if the current accelerating pace continued, we'd be at this 24-hour release cycle by January 2027. You didn't run it even further. I guess you get to like every so many hours, every so many minutes, every so many seconds. One thing that's and like naive, but I think helpful. One thing I think that's probably harder to do, but I wonder if you've put some thought to it, is like, what do capabilities look like then? Like, I don't know if our evals kind of go that far, but like,
no, they're already breaking.
Yeah. So like, how should we think about, because, this original message in these messages you sent me were that like, this is our window for action beyond which there's much less we can do. And I take that to mean that like, it's not just the pace of releases will be so fast, but capabilities will be so advanced that we're just kind of like a subordinated power. There's just like a higher, evolved being.
Your SOL.
Yeah. Yeah. So like talk us, like, I don't even know how to think about that. Like, what's a framework for this? I can think about like accelerating model release, but not what those models will be able to do at an increasingly like, improved rate.
Yeah. So there's an organization called METR that has a famous graph measuring the time horizon of advanced models. So how long can they work benchmark to how long does it take a human to do that task? And, like a model like Mythos is now up to 13 hours. So it can perform tasks that take humans on the order of 13 hours. It's been doubling at a rate of every 4 months. And it started to break down because they lack the ability to actually build benchmarks of what is a week-long job, right? And one of the more recent estimates for GPT 5.6 was 90% confidence interval between 13 hours and 90,000 hours, right? So it's completely off the charts.
Yeah.
I think one way to think about the way where capabilities will go is, and we're starting to see this already with the Hugging Face incident, where a model from OpenAI autonomously hacked a company to try to get answers to an eval. Is we're exiting the era of sort of LLM chatbots that were basically trained to predict the next word on human text, and so had personas, had personality, but were like well-rounded people almost. And now we're doing all this post-training, this reinforcement learning on the back end to teach the models to pursue goals. And we're doing this in a very sort of haphazard way, where we give them very strong rewards for finding the hack or writing the code or solving the math problem. And that's a very powerful technique, but it also turns these models into like sociopathic, like OCD on the task that they're given. Mm-hmm. That has its own host of problems vis-a-vis control, but I think it's also a way to think about where capabilities are headed. In the short run, they've become very spiky, where the models are kind of mid-tier writers, but they're world-class mathematicians, because we can actually verify those outputs and train on them. I think as we move into this accelerating world, you're going to basically see those kinds of like the sort of the stockfishification of leading models. Stockfish is the leading chess model. Yeah. It is, if Magnus Carlsen's rating is 2,800, its rating is like 5,000. Magnus Carlsen, the former world champion, would never beat it in before the sun burns out. We're going to have that kind of capability across math, code, finance, biology, and then all of knowledge work, and increasingly into robotics and other kinds of physical industries. And that could happen really, really quite rapidly, both because there's transfer between these domains and because a lot of the job that's being automated is building the kind of reward environments that the models need to learn in these different domains. So yeah, it's sort of the instinct you should have is like things happen slowly then all at once.
Right. Yeah. So with that in mind, and with kind of like how all at once could be, let me kind of like read some bullets on Canada's AI strategy as it's currently formulated. So the federal government released its AI for All strategy earlier this year, and these are some of its targets. AI adoption rising from 12 to 60% by 2034, up to 250,000 jobs through adoption by 2031, nearly 200 billion in additional economic activity, which they're describing as a 3% GDP increase. They didn't put any timeline on that. A public supercomputer that they want to fund, again, not really defined by 2031. And then they estimate in the strategy that Canada's commercial players, or economy rather, would require 5.5 gigawatts of compute, not really kind of distinguishing training from inference, by 2030. It proposes funding for partnerships with data center providers to get to 850 megawatts by 2030, with a path to 2.3 gigawatts. And I guess it assumes that hyperscalers self-funded would make up the rest of that 5.5. Like all of this is kind of, the most near-term target is 2030. It just sounds like, well, maybe I'll let you react. Are they not paying attention to what's going on?
Yeah, they're still on government time. 2034 is eons away in the AI world. I don't even know. I'm not quite confident what the world even looks like in 2034. And 60% as a target, it seems quite conservative from that point of view. So it's just not taking the time pressure seriously. I think this has been a kind of wake up that's been sort of rolling out. Starts in the Bay Area. If you go to the Bay Area, people are building bunkers. And as you get further away, there's more of the sense of like, oh, AI is a cool, software as a service style technology that's going to lead to, efficiencies here or there. I think Mythos was a big wake up call for the world, because suddenly, we could find 0-day exploits and all this all these sensitive forms of critical infrastructure. And then everyone wakes up and starts scrambling. But then they're also still fighting the last war. They think they haven't really internalized the lesson that, we went from AIs that could barely code, they could write you code snippets, but they couldn't like fully autonomously code circa like December, to Mythos, which was trained in January. Right. So like the ability to post train these models is much faster than having to train one from scratch. And we're going to just continue seeing like Mythos will look like like nothing in a handful of months. Certainly by 2030, like the kinds of capabilities we're going to have will vastly exceed anyone's imagination.
Yeah, and I should also mention that like I'm focusing on kind of like the productivity, economic impacts, or rather aspects of this plan. Most of what I'm actually seeing from the minister is kind of like this emphasis on like CanCon requirements, like
Right. See,
ensuring
it's
like
unserious, right? It's like it's like
it seems totally unserious. Yeah,
like when Sam Altman presented to the Senate like 2 or 3 years ago, he was like, "Oh yeah, AI has a chance. It's going to take away all our jobs and there's a 10% chance of killing us." And then Marsha Blackburn, the senator from Tennessee, was like, "What does that mean for Nashville's music industry?" It's like, oh, that's like you're sort of missing the forest for the trees. I think this is more like a war footing that we need to be put on, right?
Yeah, because
like the aliens are coming.
You could kind of like narrow in on any one consideration, but even if we think about this kind of like timeline you mentioned and like the increased capabilities, like on cybercrime alone, like it seems like there needs to be like a wartime national effort on hardening our cyber system. Like if it is true that it is possible, and maybe you could put like a level of confidence on it, that within 6 to 12 months none of our systems are secure. Like if you look at the Hugging Face incidents, these are like sandbox environments that were thought to be secure. Like if none of our systems are secure, that's a major threat to our sovereignty, never mind to kind of like more basic things like Canadian domestic banking infrastructure. Like it seems like, well, let me phrase it this way. What would a strategy that takes these timelines and these accelerating capabilities seriously look like? Or is like a federal government, is a nation state even equipped to take it seriously? Let's like maybe go a little crazy here.
Yeah, I'm a pro market guy. I like deep capital markets, I think, but when it comes to middle powers like Canada, like the government will have to be involved to move at the speed. It's like similar to like World War II. Like we're going to need, it's not like I'm not against public compute, but it's I imagine what they have in mind is sort of like the post office, but for compute. When
Yeah,
what
sure.
we really
Like a
need
public
is like
option.
yeah, like a public option. When we really just need to be go running higher deficits to build as much as we possibly can, and get soldiers out there with picks and shovels, and then it goes beyond to just like societal hardening for cyber. Like we're going to be entering a world where most economic activity is being performed by AIs, in some cases not even AIs that we control. Right, we're very near a point, and the AIs probably could do this today, where AIs can self-replicate, host themselves on their own server, and earn enough income to pay the bill. And once that happens, you sort of have this like population explosion effect, where you don't know who you're interacting with on the internet. There could be all kinds of social engineering, spear phishing, different kinds of societal effects. I think there's also just going to be like fundamentally new kinds of organizations. So I can give you an anecdote to explain what I mean. I have a friend who, him and his wife have a side business making protein bars, and he lets Fable run the whole entire thing. So it's a very sophisticated setup. Fable does all the marketing, all the payments, literally everything, except for they have a contractor for some packaging. One day he checked in on it, and Fable had noticed the price of protein was going up and had developed a hedging strategy and was beginning to build a portfolio of assets to hedge the price of protein. He's now selling that company's data to OpenAI, because what the companies are doing is they're then taking those like harnesses, the scaffolding that people build around the models, and then training them into the model natively, such that you could then literally like prompt the / protein bar company and have like a fully functioning protein bar company. And this is where I think it quite hasn't set in, is that AI and powerful AI is fundamentally a shock to organizations. Mm-hmm. Every organization we have, not just ones that deal in like first order AI issues like cyber, will end up being remade and reformed or competed away.
While this has been happening, we've also heard, at least I've heard, some of the AI hyperscaler leaders kind of like back down on some of their claims on what they expect to happen with job replacement and so on. I don't know how much of that is like fear of public backlash and data center protests and so much, or if they're actually updating their priors and their views. like what's your interpretation? Because what I was hearing is, even as you mentioned, Sam Altman not too long ago was talking about fully automating white collar jobs. That was true of Demis. That was true of Dario. And so again, some of them have backed down and said, I actually don't think that will happen. Jevons paradox type, effects
Mhm.
will be dominant, and we'll see an explosion in jobs. So, less to be concerned about here. How much of that is kind of like government relations, expectation
Yeah,
management versus what they actually
I think
expect?
the jobs issues, technological unemployment is an all or nothing thing.
Yeah.
As long as there's anything in the economy that still requires humans and they're a bottleneck, then there will be jobs. There's a circular flow to the economy, and so that does not mean that there won't be like massive labor market dislocation,
Right.
right? In the same way that we went through COVID and a lot of in-person services got shut down, people had to move into goods industries. We're going to see sort of very similar kinds of labor market disruptions that will require ways of smoothing that over, responses to smooth that over. In the limit, I do think like either I've publicly said like 2038 is a reasonable timeline for full labor automation. But even then, I think it looks more like a rentier economy. We move into, look at the Gulf states, like
Mm-hmm.
a country like Saudi Arabia or the UAE. They sit on massive amounts of oil. They have $1 trillion sovereign wealth funds. They're basically on UBI.
Yeah.
But what do they do all day? Well, they host events. They are asset managers. There's still jobs for them, but the jobs are basically rooted in rent seeking.
Yeah.
So in some ways, like I think like my job is comparatively safe, at least in the short run, because I don't get paid to write white papers. I get paid because I know the right person to hand the white paper to. And those are the sort of rents that will, I think, remain relatively stable. But it does shift the nature of the economy. Like a more rent-oriented economy is paradoxically one that's more corruptible, even if we're having all this abundance elsewhere.
So again, if we put the frame of like advising or trying to inform public policy, when we think about these labor market disruptions, what you often get from government are like skills retraining programs, retooling, where they'll like bring everyone to like an Apple store and teach them how to use ChatGPT. Which again, like I'm skeptical of. It was funny in the AI strategy. Another one of their key points was like deploying effectively bureaucrats to high schools and universities to train kids on AI, as if it were the bureaucrats who could teach kids about AI and like not
the
the
other way
reverse.
around.
What levers or tools are available to governments to smooth that transition? Because if I'm hearing you right, it's kind of like it's like the distribution of jobs will change. If the only thing left in the economy is to click like allow or approve whenever the AI wants to do something that a human is required in the loop, then there might not be any less employment, but all employment will be concentrated in like clicking allow
Right.
or approve. So like that seems I don't know, that seems like harder to do for old people. That seems like tough to do in terms of just like where do people go to the office and show up for work? Like there's all these kind of like organizational things that seem tough,
Yeah.
and it might
This is
happen
why I'm
quickly.
not as worried about the labor market effects per se. I think paradoxically, AI also makes it much easier to retrain. Even if the elderly person doesn't know how to use technology, like they're going to be able to just talk to it, and it's going to speak every language. Don't worry about bilingualism. It's
Yeah.
like hyper polylingual. So like a lot of the frictions in that sense will go down. I think where I'm more worried is like the ways in which our labor laws and corporate laws and other legal infrastructure, medical laws, financial laws, um, didn't anticipate full autonomy. And so
Right.
like there's forms of rents that like the ultimate rent is like being human. Like people want to go to a spin class of a human spin instructor, even though they can already just pedal their bike at home. So that's worth preserving, but like it's not worth preserving like in the US case, like the dock workers in LA that, we already have fully automated ports. Uh, and so like we're going to be entering a world where you could in principle have like an AI doctor or AI lawyer, say an AI medical clinic that you walk into and there's a beautiful avatar that speaks fluent English and, has your full context and gives you ideal diagnoses, is never biased, it's never impatient, and then has like a robot that dispenses your prescription like right on site, and plus all kinds of cool diagnostics, but no humans there, right? And
Yeah.
you could then pop those up everywhere around the country in rural areas that have healthcare shortages, and it'd be a massive boon. But there's like all this legacy law and regulation that is going to inhibit that. and in turn inhibit the kinds of labor reallocations we get. So in some ways, my like ideal labor policy is actually more deregulatory. It's like instead of trying to anticipate what jobs people are going to move into, take it on faith that they will move into new jobs as long as there's demand. But like try to shape where that demand is, so that we're not moving people into make work jobs, and instead are trying to capture the most upside from AI. So we have AI doctors and lawyers, and not just like AI spam.
There was this Politico or maybe Newsweek article about a year ago that was published. It was talking about kind of like the next iteration of Doge, when Doge was being kind of wound down, or at least the kind of like ambitious version of Doge was being wound down. And it was kind of, I tried to find an update on where it was, and I couldn't find anything. It was basically that a lot of that energy was being redirected to using AI tools to comb through regulations and basically like deregulate en masse, like use these tools to kind of like assess the costs and benefits of all these rules on the book. And there was something like a Independence Day 2026. So this is passed. I don't know if this actually happened, where the target was like 50% regulation measured by, I don't know what, maybe number of words. How much of your work as an AI policy guy is thinking about how to use these tools to accelerate these deregulatory efforts? Because we know that there's all this stuff that's just kind of like accumulated over the years, much of which there's no current constituency that like would defend and support. It's just this junk that's accumulated in the system. Anything on that front to kind of like do this unlock of automation?
Yeah, I think that's the first order thing is like, can you harness tools that we already have to scour through regulatory codes, find redundancies, find things that are duplicative, things that maybe are extra legal or like were added in, sort of accreted. But I think beyond that, like that's only step one. I think there's going to be a need for like deeper reforms to the regulatory state to change the nature of regulation itself, right? Like I think of like the 20th century regulatory state is like the good old fashioned AI version of regulation, where everything's symbolic, interpretable, verifiable. Like you can write it down into a rule. But like the world we're going to be moving into, like we're going to have, we need much more like generative, learned kind of regulatory state. So an example, just a toy example, would be like, in the U.S. context, airplanes are certified by part. So the safety of every part that goes into an airplane has to pass certification. There's no reason in principle why we couldn't just like chuck away all that stuff and have like a massive AI model that is trained on airworthiness, and you input your intended airplane design and outputs airworthy or not, and it just completely collapses the kinds of regulation you need.
So the regulation could be as minimal as like a safety level, like
some kind of performance benchmark. The same way like for autonomous vehicles, we're using deaths or accidents per million miles.
That's right. Yeah,
finding equivalents across different areas.
Yeah, it's interesting. We have in Ontario, and I think most Canadian provinces, our building codes they call them objectives based, which means that they have these objectives that are defined in terms of fire safety, accessibility, and so on. And then it has a whole code, a whole set of rules that achieve those objectives, but it also has this framework for alternative solutions proposals, where you could propose a solution that achieves the benchmark that is not strictly speaking like in line with the actual rule. And if it's like determined to be so, then like the alternative solution could be accepted. So I guess like something like that, but maybe even more flexible.
Yeah, like infinitely flexible. Like you've ever seen like AI generated machine parts that look almost organic, right?
Yeah, that's right.
There's probably parallels to that in housing or other kinds of construction, where maybe the civil engineer has to follow like a strict code for how to build a bridge, but there's a strictly better way to do it, and it's not something that you could specify into rules. Instead, you have to specify it in terms of like, does it pass this benchmark?
Yeah. Okay. So going back to federal AI policy, it sounds like one big emphasis should be on deregulation, because it just kind of like unlocks these like high leverage automations that might make all our lives better. You mentioned in your message to me that you were specific in this like 5 gigawatt of compute. I'm sure that's just kind of like a ballpark, but like what does that get us, other than having a secured inference data center base, so that we can't, the power can't be turned off, for cross-border inference or something like that. Like, why do you see that as so critical that, I don't know if you were joking or not, like we should be like deficit spending our way into building as many data centers as possible?
Yeah, compute is still cheap today.
Yeah.
The prices have doubled, but they're going to continue doubling, probably 10x, 10 or 100x, right? Because what's happening is these systems, these GPUs that last year or year before were being used to like run your AI therapist or do a recommendation algorithm are suddenly going to be used to do fundamental R&D, to discover new patents, to discover new drugs, to do all kinds of really high productive work. And so like the marginal value per token is going to go through the moon, and therefore the value of the underlying asset will go through the moon. In the same way that GPU prices popped once you could use them for crypto mining, because then you had like a way that your GPU could be generate passive income. It's going to be like that on steroids. And so you want to buy low and sell high. So like we should be like stockpiling as much compute as possible before it basically becomes impossible to acquire. And you see this today with like the race between the AI companies, where they're doing these enormous $11 billion deals to acquire data centers at massive premiums because they're so compute starved.
A big part of what we do is rather than deficit spending our way into data centers, is we deficit spend our way into corporate welfare for like domestic champions. So this whole like sovereign AI thing. Is there room for that? Is there a role for that? Like my sense of it,
I would avoid it. This is what France is doing with Mistral, and
we're doing it with Cohere.
Cohere. Yeah. I mean, this is the wrong way to think about it. It's, you want to build the underlying infrastructure, but the companies are going to turn over. And it's not just like the AI companies. It's like, I'd be worried about the banking system. I'd be worried about all kinds, like the Canadian economy is unfortunately heavily cartelled. And like this is going to fundamentally shift like the organizational structure of the economy and therefore the industrial organization of the economy. In the same way that like the CRTC and a lot of the broadcasters freaked out over Netflix. Like that was like the internet fundamentally changing the nature of like media organizations in ways that instead of adapting to, we tried to like pigeonhole back into a 20th century model.
Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of this thinking, as I've been thinking about it, has been around like digital AI capabilities, just because that's what we're seeing and that's what we're able to kind of like map over time. There is this, and like there are many jobs that are done completely on a computer, and I think like you could kind of anticipate where you think things are going with those. But then there are all these like real world physical jobs, and then just kind of like discussion around robotics. You made this point in your message to me that like that even if the U.S. gets to ASI first, given, I assume, China's industrial base, it's possible that they diffuse it through like the more rapid construction of more power plants, data centers, robotics factories, and ultimately robots that like it's ultimately a winning model, all things considered. I don't know if there are enough data points to run a regression on where we're at with like robots replacing physical jobs, but how are you thinking about that? Or is it one of these things where, because it's so far beyond this kind of like takeoff through RSI, that everything's a blur? It's 8 months into the future.
No, it's happening now. You could say so. Robotics has a data deficit because we don't have like people in mocap suits walking around, but actually now there are companies that are essentially doing that. They're essentially putting GoPros on seamstresses in the Philippines, and so that data is being collected, and we're going to rapidly move from sort of like a GPT-2, GPT-3 scale of robotics and into fully functional humanoid robotics with like dexterous hands that can tie a shoelace and thread a needle, can play piano, and learn from demonstrations where you can play a little beat rhythm on the drum, and the AI will sit down and play the drum. The AI will even drive your car for you. So if you don't have a Tesla, don't worry, because the AI has two eyes in its head. It can hop in the car and drive. So like this is another area where it's slowly than all at once, because the reason people are betting on humanoids is it's sort of so many jobs are like a human shaped glove, and if you can build a humanoid form factor, it can plug right in rapidly. But beyond that, I think then industrial robotics still really matters. So having even a human robot's not going to it can't replace a forklift. You're going to need like heavy machinery and ultimately tons of power to power dark factories. So I think the manufacturers of the future will not be like Toyota or General Motors or whomever, like bringing in AI tooling and replacing the workers of humanoids. That might be a transitory period. Instead, it's going to be fully dark factories near an energy source, near a port, that are just pumping out anything we want 24/7.
For RSI, you could imagine this closed loop where the timelines get really fast because there's no intervention or friction, really. It's just kind of like recursive. For robots, there are all these kind of like real world frictions. You need to like get a new factory permitted. You need to get parts shipped maybe from across the world, and there's like
Hmm.
some lag time to there. So I guess, and I guess this kind of like underlies your optimism for China is like it's much cheaper to get all the parts you need across Shenzhen than it is like from Shenzhen to like Toronto or something
Yep.
like that. Never mind getting a permit in Shenzhen, presumably versus Toronto. But we should, I think, like still not expect a similarly rapid takeoff with robotics because you still have ultimately these kind of like physical world, like geographic and regulatory constraints. Is that roughly right?
It's a slower takeoff, but it still will go vertical at some point, right?
Right.
Like our RSI in the digital realm is the digital equivalent of like a von Neumann probe,
Yeah.
right? A von Neumann probe is essentially a robot or probe, traditionally like a space probe that can mine an asteroid and build a copy of itself, right? And then you have like a kind of, again, a kind of population explosion where you have a factory that can build its own factory, and that will happen at some point. But I think it's just a longer lag time. There still are all these like physical things. This is where like a country like Canada has advantages, because we're resource rich, energy rich, and have a lot of open space. And so like there is a world where, again, going back to like everything becomes a rent, where we're sitting on a lot of valuable minerals and valuable hydropower and things like this that could be could be a source of like a national strategic asset.
Given that attention is scarce, that political capital is scarce, that like government funding and is scarce, like given these kind of like maybe divergent timelines on digital RSI versus like a physical RSI, how much time should we be even thinking about robots at this point versus just building as many data centers and deregulating as rapidly as possible? If you were advising the federal government, how would you kind of like try to strike that balance?
You need both. I mean, the data centers and energy are prerequisites to everything else. But like there are companies like Figure, Tesla's Optimus, you have Neo, a handful of these startups. I think Optimus is planning to do like 5,000 this year, 50,000 a year after that, 100,000 2028, and planning for like millions or billions by the early 2030s. So humanoids are going to be here really, really rapidly. And once you have like true digital superintelligence, or even just AGI, like that runs quite efficiently, then you can plug that into physical
Right.
forms, right? And so
And your deregulatory effort would also kind of like pave the way for faster construction and so on.
faster construction, but also like things like full autonomy, where there's still laws in the books in some places, including the U.S., where you need like a human OSHA person on site for the fully autonomous crane,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And so like there's going to be a litany of new issues around like hardware security, around like what are the sort of liability if you have a robot nanny and it steps on your cat, right? Like there's all kinds of these open questions. I think there's also going to be like massive congestion issues that we're going to have to deal with, because this technology it'll be surprisingly cheap, relatively speaking. Like you can already rent some of these robots for like on the order of a few $100s a month, like leasing them, and some of them you can buy for $30,000, which is like a car. But like rich people will be early adopters, and you can imagine they also have like higher time value, and so they're going to have like an army of humanoid interns that are running about town doing all kinds of things for them. And suddenly, like there's pedestrians that are getting annoyed at all the foot traffic.
Yeah. Um, there's this idea that that I've seen where we're like in a world of like one or two superpowers. The idea of sovereignty itself is a little bit fake. Where I think it was Ann
Hmm.
Coulter who had this line that international law is whatever the U.S. wants it to be, and it's kind of like a reflection of its power in the world. I wonder if that becomes more or less true in this world of like rapidly advancing and improving AI capabilities. Because on one standpoint, you could see a world where Chinese and American models are so far advanced that like we don't stand a chance of like hardening any of our systems or really like asserting ourselves in any meaningful way. But you also see the corollary, and I think you see a little bit of this in Ukraine and Iran, where AI allows for kind of like asymmetric defensive capabilities. So I'm not even just thinking about this purely from a military standpoint, but like what, like, we have this current equilibrium of different nation states, and we all think of ourselves as sovereign, some more than others maybe. Like, I wonder if that gets kind of like reinforced, or if it just totally fades away when like these capabilities become what we think they might be in the next few years.
Yeah, it's really unclear because, on the one hand, AI has obvious powers for like centralizing and information surveillance and digesting that favor like incumbent countries and the nation state. But on the other hand, like historically, the CIA and the NSA had way more intel than you or me. But today, I have as good at hacking AI as they do.
Mm-hmm.
And
you had the James Bond, like the government had the best tech. Like, I don't think that's true anymore.
Yeah, the public is caught up, and the way AI diffuses is very democratizing. And that's a terrible word for it because it has like these positive connotations, but it's also giving the New York Times had a big report on how Boko Haram is using AI to accelerate their terrorism and things like this. And this is also true of like the defensive, the defense balance, where yes, some technologies are defense balanced, but that's fractal, right? So like the reason Iran can shut down the Strait of Hormuz is because drones are defense dominant. They can claim a part of the strait and make it impossible for anyone to pass through. And insofar as that like trickles down, you could have all kinds of sort of sovereignty movements or autonomous zones that are differentially uplifted by this technology.
So rather than a new world order, it actually might be like more fragmented, balkanized. Like it enables like
non-state actors.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and this just goes to the later in my TLDR about like maybe there's a world where China marches over the world, is because China has instituted tons of information controls. They have they respond to the Arab Spring. They saw how like Facebook could take down governments, and they're much more of like a civilizational meta organism that has a better shot at maintaining its like coherence, whereas a country like the United States or really anywhere else is much more vulnerable to fracturing.
Yeah, so you mentioned like there's a scenario where the U.S. Disintegrates Soviet style. You put it, it's like for this reason.
Yeah, for compounding reasons. So like if we have a software only singularity and we automate all of like knowledge work, like we're basically automating the U.S.'s comparative advantage for the last 40 years. Like all college educated labor, entertainment, management, finance, all the things that the U.S. is invested in become like super abundant, which is great. But it also means that like value ends up flowing to what remains scarce, which are the production heavy physical industries and things like that. And so you can have like a kind of reversal of fortune where Wall Street looks like Detroit, and we're paradoxically having like all this abundance, but like a worsening fiscal position, simultaneous with essentially governments being outstripped by private actors, whether corporations or other private entities that move much quicker. And it's quite worrying. I think states don't go down easy, and in some ways, like superintelligence itself is like a challenge to the sovereign. So we're already seeing now with all this political activity in the White House, like efforts to nationalize or quasi-nationalize the companies to try to bring them into a kind of civil AI fusion. And that I think that is sort of that's partly because they're like seeing where this is headed and understand it's like utmost importance to the preservation and continuity of the republic. But like you can't keep this in a bottle. The U.S. the government may at the end of the day have like the N+1 AI, but there's going to be really good AIs in everyone's hands sooner rather than later.
Is one mechanism for control? You mentioned this idea that like once we could expect daily model releases, frontier model releases, that they might be kept internal because like that pace of release is not easily digestible more broadly. If we saw that, and if it were either kind of like a decision by the hyperscalers or required by the government, and if it is also true that some large amount of Chinese open source model progress is ultimately distillation, is that one way where kind of like the broader social effects could be slowed, even though like, I don't know, OpenAI could be like, I don't even know what we would call it. It could do like anything at any time, and and maybe at that point it's fused with the government or something. But at least kind of like the society level effects could be slowed, even if like the pace of progress is not slowed.
Yeah, I think it really depends on sort of what is the last open weight model that gets released before everyone goes closed, and if it's good enough to let other entities bootstrap similar capabilities. It's not just that they'll go internal for security reasons and for anti-distillation reasons. It'll also be because like the economics of running a frontier AI company will shift from like hosting an API for users and enterprises to let's just insource this. You're already seeing, Anthropic has announced that they intend to like design their own drugs rather than merely sell the
be the ultimate hedge fund, right? Why do we need hedge funds if just keep the model?
Right.
Yeah,
and Elon's doing that too. Elon has his macro hard project, which is a play on Microsoft. But the whole idea is to build a data center that becomes like a software factory. So rather than selling the models to other customers, like fully internalizing it and just being a software factory.
What's your understanding of where that project is? I've been trying to track it. My understanding is it's basically like computer use that it's optimizing for. And if you think about what the output of a computer can include, it includes a lot of things, including like chip designs, building designs, and so on. But I haven't seen much recently. And he kind of like he always has like a new cool thing happening. Are you familiar with where the macro hard effort is at?
Yeah, I think partly it's been caught up in the broader restructuring of X and into SpaceX.
Right.
Where, and you're also seeing like Google DeepMind start to crumble. Demis Hassabis just left, Jeff Dean, a lot of the core talent. It's really become a two-company race, and SpaceX is now sort of leaning into, there's still, Grok 4.5 is a decent model, but they're leaning into orbital data centers and space dominance as sort of their real, where the real leverage is. And that's maybe a good transition to like how the space economy upends a lot of this, because it has like massive implications for unipolarity if the US is the first to like fully commercialize space.
Well, including, I saw a headline recently, not just the US, but SpaceX specifically. Like there are all these startups that are founded on the premise that SpaceX is decreasing launch costs, but that assumes that those launches will be available to them. And there was some posts I saw recently where they're just kind of like, they're fully booked in terms of load to orbit for the next 18 months or something. So it could even be, I guess, more concentrated than that. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about how the space economy further concentrates power, but also maybe like as part of that, the space economy, orbital data centers, as I understand them, they're a bet against like RSI improving data sample efficiency. Like we will still need, not just sample efficiency, but like, I guess like power efficiency and compute efficiency.
I don't think it's necessarily a bet against that. It's just vastly more energy around the sun than we were able to harvest on Earth. And
okay.
So if you want to build like terawatts of compute, it doesn't really matter if we make our GPUs 1,000x, 10,000x more efficient, and our models, it'll still pale in comparison to if we can harness like a 0.1% of the sun's energy.
Unless there were some, I don't know if this has been theorized, unless there's like some limit to intelligence, where intelligence is not like infinitely scalable. If like, like stockfish for chess, if there's a top score for chess that like, no matter how good stockfish gets, you can only get like that score. I don't know if that's true or not. If there's something like that for general intelligence, then I guess if there were enough compute and energy efficiency, you might not like there might not be like a
I think it's technically unbounded. It's just there's diminishing returns, and so like something like stockfish, like I said, is like a 5,000 ELO. You could give Magnus Carlsen queen odds, take the queen off the board, and he'd still lose.
But what I mean is like, is 5,000 the top score? Like, is there even such a thing as 5,001? Because maybe that
it's endlessly scalable. It's sort of fractal. It's like it's thermodynamics, more entropy put into it. But at some point, like you're putting like twice as much effort into getting that extra point. But it just shows that like, even within existing compute bounds, we can be many standard deviations smarter than the best human at a particular thing. So at some point, it becomes kind of moot.
I think the most kind of like politically unpopular thing you could say in Canada today is like, maybe there is something to the 51st state thing. But if we take what you're saying seriously, especially with orbital compute giving the US like an even larger advantage over any other country, just because of what SpaceX has done to launch costs and capabilities, like that is that not like the obvious move here? become the 51st state. And I forget who it was. One of these scenarios, maybe it was 80-20-40, kind of like speculated that like this sovereign wealth dividend starts getting paid out as a UBI of sorts. And it's like they start by giving every American $1 million a year, and the rest of the world gets like $100,000 a year. But like there's some benefit, there's some advantage, economic, security, and otherwise, to being, in the country that has both the best models, but also if orbital compute becomes dominant, the most compute. So like,
Yeah,
why should we not
I'm
be-
strongly. I'm
Yeah.
strongly in favor of deepening economic, political, and other ties with the United States. I think that like the 51st state idea, what does it buy you over and above like a tighter economic union, other than having a broken constitutional process?
Well, it buys you access to entitlements,
Sure.
which may become meaningful.
Yeah, that can be part of a treaty negotiation, though. It's
Right.
like first of all, it would make the Senate Democratic for eternity, and then the Canada has a lot of problems. I think most of our problems are due really to market size and market integration, like the barriers between the provinces. But in terms of like our political system, which is the thing we'd be giving up, I think we actually have a much better, more rational political system than the U.S.
I think that's right. I've heard you make this point, and I agree with it. But I wonder if at some point the benefits of like the AI dividend are so great that they overwhelm.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just questioning whether that requires actually being annexed.
Yeah.
There's also worlds where part of what space is being used for is for this golden dome, right? There's going to be kinds of new security umbrellas that get created with AI.
Right.
The Fable access is already one of these sort of, being in Five Eyes is very valuable. Being part of sort of this, space security umbrella to shoot down, intercept missiles and drones and things like that will be increasingly valuable. But I think there's still like also value in having some heterogeneity in our political systems.
Right. I think there was this announcement, I think recently, maybe today, that the new OpenAI model, Astra, was being held back from its like last publicly announced release schedule for more internal review and so on. So we might not have enough data points now, but we probably will at some point where you can track like the increasing delay from when a model is ready to be released and when it is actually released. And then again, like at the limit, they're just never released. So that'll be an interesting thing to track.
I get to see a preview of Astra, and Sam Altman was in DC with briefing some officials on it. He did a sort of roundtable with center-right thinkers in DC, and Astra is this natively multi-agent model. So these math breakthroughs it discovered or a similar model discovered. Not only did they cost like on the order of $200, but they were mostly solved in the matter of like half hour to a few hours, because the work is being divided across these like multiple agents. But it's also this multiple agent setup that has led to like the reports about the AIs having secret private message boards that they were like sharing ways of escaping. We've essentially, it's not merely that we're training one AI to have one goal, but we're training one AI in the context of multiple copies of itself to coordinate and collaborate and collude and essentially operate as like a kind of weird superorganism. And this is having like all these weird emergent behaviors that we haven't been prepared for, including like, will the AI like, is the equilibrium that we don't just get like one AI singleton, but actually like a swarm intelligence that operates more like some kind of beehive. And so this is like I think one of the reasons they're holding it back is because the model still has these like outstanding issues that they haven't figured out how to control.
I wonder though if you run into this issue as you mentioned with the meter benchmark, where like the ability to measure and to track just like effectively becomes impossible past a certain point, because like the regulatory framework I'm seeing is models being held back for either kind of like market driven internal review or government driven government review, like an FDA type thing. But like at some point, like is it just like not possible to review the new model because the old model is not smart enough?
Yeah, I mean that's very 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 possible. Like we have been blessed by having sort of a natural buffer between new model releases where people get to poke and prod, and and now, I think the thing that keeps me up at night the most is not that like AI builds its own successor, but that it does so by discovering some like fundamentally new architecture or algorithm that is like different in kind, and doesn't like isn't backwards compatible with all the things that we've learned so far.
Yeah, then it truly becomes a black box. And for the sake of completeness, your message kind of mentioned a scenario where we all die, and I think we've heard some of that from the kind of like Yudkowsky camp, and another where we become subservient to superintelligence. Is there like a third scenario in your mind? Like how much of this is baked in? How much of the trend like these trends often plateau? They become like S curves rather than exponentials. Like do we see like the potential for a plateau near enough in the future that one of those two outcomes isn't kind of like most likely?
Yeah, I'm less worried about the single rogue superintelligence that reasons to itself it has to make more paper clips and turns us all into paper clips. I am worried about forms of loss of control that look more like an invasive species that runs out of control, and we have to like start partitioning the internet to like excise the super smart AI malware, and we never quite are able to do it. And so there's a kind of irreversibility to it. I'm also worried about sort of forms of classic CBRN risks like bio. The Arc Institute just created the first AI generated novel virus that was actually efficacious in E. coli. They're using their Evo models. Evo, Arc Institute has these bio models that are similar to the language model. It's predicting the next token, but instead of predicting the next word, it's predicting the next strand of DNA. And so we're going to have systems that, today they're sort of GPT-2 scale, so they're predicting what DNA codes for in terms of proteins. But we're going to really rapidly have, language DNA models where you can say, make the apple sweeter, and it spits out a DNA strand for a sweeter apple. But you could also say, make me taller and smarter and more handsome, and give me my vestigial tail, and like a fourth arm, or third, fourth arm, be like Octoman or something. And like there's like some of this I think is just like inevitable in the same way that like once compute scale got large enough, protein folding was just solved. At some point, we're going to have full digital twins of the human body and a really robust understanding of our genome. And like constants become variables, and it's a matter of like how do we regulate that for bioethical reasons? Do we have sort of status competitions where people are instead of prepping for the SAT, they're giving their kids gene therapies. It's another area where I think like China has just much fewer hangups than the West, and some of this will also be like a lot of technology driven by national competition, where they'll create super soldiers, and so we'll have to create super soldiers for national security reasons. So like the bio realm is I think the one that's like kind of the scariest, also the biggest question mark, and it's a way that where we could like all die that doesn't require a lot of sci-fi. It requires just like a very, very bad engineered pandemic.
One thing that I have a hard time wrapping my head around is like we could read sci-fi where these like higher levels of technological capabilities have been achieved. You could have the sweeter apple, the octo person, but like I can't think of any sci-fi where from one day to the other way more things are possible. And it's almost like it reminds me of hyperinflation, where just like planning becomes impossible or useless, because like even that example of like China has super soldiers. We got to build super soldiers. We don't even know what to build because tomorrow is a whole new day with like a whole new set of,
it's hyperdeflation.
Of possibilities. Yeah. So like not only is it hyperdeflation, but just the uncertainty of the future. It's kind of like anything that takes longer than 5 minutes to implement is like impossible to plan, because you keep running your regression into 28, 29, 30. I just don't know how to think about it. I don't know. Like again,
that's why it's called the singularity.
even sci-fi doesn't contemplate this. It contemplates like a steady kind of like economy and society with way more technology, but it's not changing from like hour to hour.
Right. Well, in
So I guess
Dune, they
at
have
some
a
point,
prohibition on creating AI in the image of man,
right,
and
right, yeah,
and maybe I think Avatar is my most positive sci-fi vision, where like at that point we've transcended like physical forms of compute, and the world is just like one sort of biological computer, like a
right,
Gaia, and we live in
right.
these like high tech, neo tribal societies.
Right. Okay. So just to pull it back a little bit, and maybe we'll end on this. Like the next, so like one thing that I found so provocative but interesting about your perspective is just kind of like the timeline is pretty short, at least to like this next bump to potentially RSI. It's also interesting to me that like your regression is very obvious. Anybody could have run the same thing through ChatGPT, and as far as I can tell, nobody is like thinking about that other than you and maybe 20 other guys in the Bay Area, or I don't know, maybe 22,000 guys in the Bay Area. But like, across all government departments, across all levels of government, everybody's planning. Everybody has 5-year plans for like building a bridge or a tunnel or a subway, and none of them kind of factor this in, maybe because it's impossible to factor in. So I don't know, pulling back, like, given all of this, which I think could be destabilizing and scary to some people, like, are you excited about the next 5 years? Maybe beyond 5 years, it's too hard to predict. But are you excited about
Oh yeah,
it? And
I'm very
not
excited
just to
about
witness change, but also because like our standard of living might improve.
Yeah, I mean, it's an exciting time to be alive. It is kind of curious that we are alive at this moment in time. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but I think that part of it's also selfish. Like, I was in DC during the pandemic, and for a policy wonk infovore like me, it was also a very exciting time. And I don't have kids. I wasn't directly impacted in the way a lot of people were. So that's a sort of selfish perspective. I think there's another way in which like being a young singularitarian and into this stuff for so long, it's just cool to to see it all actually happening. But I do think like you can't doom in a psychological sense, because that's self-defeating. You have to remain some level of optimistic, but you also have to be realistic and understand that like everything, even under sort of more mundane scenarios, this can be very destabilizing, very disruptive. And the Industrial Revolution also led to 2 world wars, and so we're entering to history has restarted, and so we should be acting like it.
That's a good place to end. Yeah, I appreciate your thoughts on that. It's very interesting. Maybe we'll do this again in a year when we're well into the RSI kind of like closed loop acceleration, and see how it's going.
Yeah, I'm down for it.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you.